Good evening, and welcome to He's Alive, 40 Days of Preaching, Teaching, and Prayer. We are so thankful that you have chosen to be with us this evening, whether it's in our audience or whether you are viewing us from another venue, whether it's YouTube or whether it's on the website Guardrails. He's Alive is celebrating its 25th year of existence, and we are so thankful that the Lord has blessed us thus far. And what better way to do that in celebration than to talk about ministry? What does the Bible say about ministry? God has called us all to service, all to ministry. And what a better way to say, how is it that I can serve you, Lord? So in our 40 days, we have people that are coming from all over the country that are spending time with us, sharing us about their ministry experience, what God has shown them, what God has given them, and how they have shared that with their community, and how they have shared that around the world. So once again, we're so thankful that you have thought enough to be with us tonight. You may have heard us speak of guardrails in many different areas as we've gone through started these 40 days. And I just want to share a little bit with you about guardrails. Guardrails is a social community that He's Alive is developing for laity training. So that's the whole point. We have speakers that are coming in, and all of this information is being recorded, and we want to get all of those recordings and housed in guardrailsmedia.com. And our speakers are not just speaking here in the evening, but during the day they're actually going to Upper Columbia Conference, spending some classroom time and just recording some practical tips, practical ideas on ministry, whether it's children's ministry or whether it's women's ministry, health ministries, just ministry in general. How do we minister to our community? So I want us to just remember guardrailsmedia.com is where you will be able to find all of the information and all of the programs that we are airing. I want to make an emphasis as well. In the middle of all of this, the middle of our 40 days starting December 26th all the way through January 3rd, we are having a prayer emphasis. We are super excited about that. We want to start off the new year of 2019 with an emphasis on prayer. So we have Randy Maxwell that will be coming in. He's from Renton, Washington. He's worked with Pacific Press. We're excited that he's coming in to share with us on prayer focus. We're also having Michael Smith, who's the ministerial director for Oklahoma Conference. He will be sharing with us as well and having a prayer focus for that time, December 26th through January 3rd. So remember to look for those days. And once again, I want you to remember guardrailsmedia.com, where all of this information will be stored. You can go there and register as an individual, or you can go there and register as a church and make it a resource, a rich resource for your church community for training. We're just excited about that. Tonight, we want to actually welcome Jim Brackett to our station. He has been conducting seminars on reversing chronic disease for nearly 40 years across the United States and other venues overseas. They have authored, he and his wife, 3 whole food plant cookbooks, the latest being the 7 Secrets cookbook, and I think many of us have heard of that cookbook. There are nearly 300,000 copies sold worldwide. Jim is a scientist who returned to graduate school to complete a master's degree in public health nutrition. His years as a science teacher makes his presentations on nutrition and getting well fascinating for all listeners. So I really want to this evening to welcome Jim Brackett. Before we start, I want to have a word of prayer with you. Father, we bow before you today. We thank you so much for who you are. We thank you so much for your love, your kindness, and your goodness. And Father, as we spend some time starting off about 7 days on health, Father, please be with us and spark our hearts to what you will have us to do and what our calling is in regards to health and how we can share and minister to others in regards to health. Thank you so much for what you're going to do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you and good evening. Good day. Our topic today is actually the heart of the matter. Now this is actually on our physical hearts, although there's parallels to our spiritual hearts as well. You know, there's many things that happen to Americans these days. They get sick from all kinds of situations that are not caused by viruses or germs. They're actually caused by lifestyle. We sometimes call them diseases of influence. but not caused by an infection. And these are some of them. Heart disease. Now, there's many kinds of heart diseases. There's arrhythmia problems. Everybody knows about atrial fibrillation. And maybe a mitral valve is stenosed, and on. But the thing that's killing people most of the time is what we call cardiovascular or coronary artery disease. Cancer turns out to be largely a lifestyle issue. There are many cancers that can be prevented by lifestyle. Diabetes is just an amazing story. Almost all the diabetes that occurs today is type 2 diabetes. There's several other kinds we'll talk about on another presentation. Caused by lifestyle, hypertension, overweight, arthritis, fibromyalgia, gout. This is just a few. Kidney stones, lupus, kidney failure, claudication. That's a word that most people don't use every day, but it has to do with the same kind of problem in the arteries of the leg that it does with the arteries in the heart. So here we have many kinds of heart diseases I mentioned. The one that's really the killer is this thing we call coronary artery disease, sometimes abbreviated CAD. And most everyone in America knows that saturated fat is not good for our hearts. It's bad for our hearts. And Americans believe then that unsaturated fat would be good for your heart. So I hope you're following this idea. Everybody sort of knows, if you will, that, for example, olive oil would be good for your heart. But unfortunately, what does it say there? That is not true. Strangely enough, and of course we'll explain that here as we go along. As long as 50 years ago, the Surgeon General of the United States made this pronouncement. This was an opinion. We didn't have science for it at that time. But there was enough evidence, he felt, that he made this statement. He said, heart disease, and I'm talking about coronary artery disease, is almost entirely preventable, he said, 50 years ago. But today we have the science. We have a large number of research projects that makes this so very clear. You can now erase this almost and say that coronary artery disease is entirely preventable, and in fact it's reversible, as we will see here in a few minutes. Now, this is a diagram, a drawing by a very famous artist who drew for medical books. And tucked up here in the corner under the liver is this green muscle, this green sac. It's that everybody knows the name of this. You might not know if you hadn't studied some anatomy, but this is the gallbladder. And the gallbladder makes bile. And it comes out of this little tube and joins this tube coming out of the liver. And when they come together, it's called the common bile duct. And it actually delivers the bile to the small intestine just after where the stomach ends. There's actually a valve there. We call it the pyloric valve. And so the bile is delivered right there to help digest fat. Now, the cholesterol connection is this. The liver makes bile, and I'm emphasizing this help. The bile does not digest the fat. If I had a whiteboard here, I'd draw you a little diagram that shows the fat, the tiniest fat particle you can see has 3 legs on it. And then it has a little top. And it's too big to be absorbed from the small intestine into the bloodstream. Too big is a little bit of a metaphor, but the body can't do that. So along comes some enzymes from the pancreas that cut one leg off, and the other leg, now this is way too tiny for a microscope to see, but nevertheless, cuts the 2 legs off. They're small enough to get absorbed into the bloodstream, and so is the rest of it, the top with the single leg. So in order for that fat to be digested and get into our system, now I'm simplifying it quite a bit there. It actually goes into the lymph first, but nevertheless, it has to be cut up or digested. And the problem is that when we eat fat and it gets out of our stomach into the small intestine, it's kind of in little balls, little globules, way too tiny to see, even with a microscope, but nevertheless, that's what it is, with hundreds of thousands of those little fat pieces all globbed together. And if the enzymes would have to digest it like that, it might take them 24 hours to digest that meal, the fat in that meal. So the bile comes along. We have a word for it that you all know this word. It's a little different than what happens when you take a dish, you put it in the sink where the water is, and you didn't put any soap in the water. And what do you see floating on top of the water? Pretty soon you see some oil or some fat. Then you take a little detergent or soap and swish it in there, and suddenly the fat disappears. It's not gone, it's been emulsified. That's the term we use. And that's what the bile does. It's a more complicated process than just soap. But you can think of the bile as soap. And it allows the digestion to take place quickly because it sort of flattens the fat out in such a tiny, thin layer that the enzymes can do their job. So that's why the word help is in quotes. Now, the liver makes more bile for saturated fat than it does for unsaturated fat. An important thing to keep in mind. More bile for saturated fat. Now, here's something that I suppose if you asked 50 people on the street, I don't know that one of them would know this. But bile is almost pure cholesterol. If you take the water out of it, it would be virtually pure cholesterol. And for most Americans, this bile is reabsorbed into the bloodstream down at the end of the small intestine. It doesn't matter too much in our discussion where that happens, but it's down in what we call the ileum. And what would that do to the amount of cholesterol found in the blood? It would raise it. This is why saturated fat is bad for your heart, because the body makes more bile for saturated fat. And that bile ends up being cholesterol in our bloods for most Americans. And I'll tell you why I say most Americans a little bit later. Thus, raising the amount of cholesterol found in the blood, and the result is an increase in coronary heart disease. Very interesting. And as I say, most Americans, if you talk to almost any, maybe an adult on the street, and you would say, which is worse, saturated fat or unsaturated fat for your heart? And most Americans well, they know, yeah, that saturated fat is not good for your heart. All right. Now, here's an interesting study done by Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn and actually some associates. He took 198 people and put them on a plant-based regimen. We usually say whole food from plants, which means that's unrefined. Now, 89% of the people followed the program, and I'll show you what that is in a minute. And out of those 89%, only one person had an event that would be a stroke, a heart attack, or death. So it's 0.6% because there were 177 people that followed the program out of the 198 patients. Now, these were all very sick people. In most cases, they couldn't do any more stents. They couldn't do another bypass surgery and so forth. And 13 of the 21 non-adherent, it's a word we don't use very often, I mean they weren't following the program, experienced some adverse event. They either died or had a heart attack or had a stroke. So 62% of the people who were sick in this time period during the study had some terrible event, and only one had that happen. And actually, it was kind of a special case. He sort of quit following the program partway through. So this is why it's correct to say, and Esselstyn wrote a book. This doctor, this researcher, he's a physician and a scientist, wrote a book, How to Reverse Heart Disease. Quite well known out there among people who are interested in this kind of thing. And he says, if they eliminated dairy, fish, meat, and what? Added oils, we considered them adherent. In other words, that was the plan. Use only plants. And when we say plants unrefined, it automatically means no oils. Most people don't think about this, but any kind of oil that we use has been taken out of a plant, and that would be a refined product. So that's how they got these people well. Now, do you remember, it's been 25 years ago, a study was done that showed that when people ate walnuts, they had less heart disease. Most every American has heard that, knows about that. I actually know the scientist that did the study. He's a friend. I attended the lecture. The first lecture that he gave, there was probably 300 people there. The word, of course, had leaked out that this study had showed that when people eat walnuts, it reduces heart disease. And it was very interesting. At the end of the study, there's always time for Q&A. So I had the temerity to jump up and raise my hand. And I said to him, this won't mean too much to you yet, but I want you to get it and process it. I said to him, were these replacement studies? And he said, oh, yes. I'm going to show you what I mean by that. It's quite interesting how Americans don't understand this. Now, since the time that walnuts were studied, and by the way, the Walnut Board paid for that study, but I know Dr. Sabate very well. He's a very honest and thorough scientist, so I don't think there's an issue there. But since that time, various scientists have studied all the nuts we commonly eat, actually including peanuts, which aren't technically nuts, but they have the same, essentially the same nutrient profile as any of the nuts. Some are higher in fat, some are lower, and so forth. But here is the average of all those nut studies. And what the red bar shows, this is the average amount of heart disease that happens in America. We're going to just call that 100%. And when people ate nuts, various kinds were studied, and this is these are the averages. You'll notice the red box on the top right. These are people that ate nuts less than. That's what that little sign means, less than once a week. The yellow bar are people that ate nuts 1 to 4 times a week. And the green bar, the people that ate nuts virtually every day. And what we mean is a handful. Bigger person, bigger hand. So they didn't measure the weight. Usually they just give them a handful. And notice, if you'll take a look under the left-hand side where it says men, how much reduction in heart disease was there for people who ate nuts 1 to 4 times a week? It's over 15%. 15% less, not just less heart disease, but events, stroke, heart attack. 15% less. It's incredible. Just a handful of nuts a day. What about the green bar? People that ate nuts almost every day. The reduction in events, again, stroke, heart attack, the reduction in those was over 50% just because they ate a handful of nuts every day. Amazing. This worked for men or women. You can see that. And on the right-hand side, people are less than 50 years old. That's what that sign again means, in case you're not familiar with it. They like to use that in the mathematical, scientific world. People that are older or younger, it works. In fact, if you notice the older people, in a certain sense, it worked a little better. Then it worked for vegetarians. On the left-hand side, the left of those two sets. Non-vegetarians, it worked not as well. You can see the yellow bar didn't decrease as much, and even the green bar didn't, but it was still working. It worked for people who didn't get much exercise on the right-hand side. Of the two sets of bars there, you can see it's not as strong as over for the people that had more activity. But it's amazing. Now, it also even works for people who are overweight. On the left of those two sets, BMI less than 24 really means that they're normal weight, and body mass index above 24 considered overweight, and it worked for them. Very interesting. Now, I'm going to show you a slide. I don't want you to laugh at this man's condition. You can smile at his question. His question is, Doctor, should I eat the diet before or after meals? Now, you think about that. This is what Americans actually do. They have heard that olive oil is good for you, according to the Mediterranean studies. They have no clue. I think you could ask 100 Americans on the street. They would not know what I'm about to share with you. In these studies, when olive oil is used, or even the nuts, they take as much fat out of their diet that they were eating as they add with the nuts or the oil. And in that case, because the nuts are mostly unsaturated fat, and olive oil, for example, is unsaturated fat. So if you replace some saturated fat, because that's what people tend to eat quite a bit of, all the meats, all the animal products are very high in saturated fat, very low in unsaturated fat. So when you replace some saturated fat with some unsaturated fat, you get less bile. Are y'all with me on that? Body makes less bile. And that means that there's less cholesterol absorbed back into the body. The Americans don't know that. That's why there's a little bit of humor in this man. Actually, this man, if he eats the olive oil on top of his salad, well, let's say it this way. Let's suppose he eats his regular meal, and then because he's heard nuts are good for you, he has a handful of nuts or something. He's worse off than he was before. He's not doing the replacement. Remember what I said at the end of Dr. Sabate's lecture? Were these replacement studies? What did he say? Oh, yes. So this is the issue which most Americans have no concept of. It's too bad because it's really hurting them a lot. So all of these nut studies were based on replacement. Now, the very first study that was ever done to see if changing your diet would affect heart disease was done clear back in 1975, and actually it was done for 6 years. And they actually did this at 2 hospitals in Finland. These were mental hospitals where people stayed long term. And that's why they chose that. They could control what the people ate. The 2 letters, N and K, are just the first letter of the hospital names. And the death rate was 13 people who died every year in Hospital N from heart disease out of each 1,000 patients. And in the other hospital, it wasn't a lot different. It was 15 plus. That's how many patients died out of each 1,000 every year. So they made what we call a dietary intervention. Now, it's pretty obvious what that means. They changed what they ate. And what they did was only two things, and really so simple. They actually took cow's milk that they were giving the people, took the fat out of it, and replaced it with soy oil. Now, if you think about this, they're actually replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fat. Almost all the fat in milk is saturated. Almost all the fat in soy is unsaturated. Now, every plant has fat. Every plant has some saturated and some unsaturated. But almost all plants, there's a couple of exceptions. Most of the fat is unsaturated. Small amounts saturated. The exceptions are the tropical oils like coconut and palm kernel oil. So if you're with me now, replacing some saturated fat with some unsaturated fat means that their body's going to make less bile, and that means the body's making less cholesterol, which means there'll be less cholesterol in the blood, which means they should have less heart disease. And they replace their butter with margarine. Now, everybody today has been told margarine is bad for you. You should quit eating margarine. So what do you suppose Americans do? They start eating butter, which is also bad for them. You say, well, which is worse? Nobody's really studied that. The margarine has mostly unsaturated fat. I should say this. It started out as oil that was mostly unsaturated. Then they artificially saturate enough of it so it's solid at room temperature. So there's still a fair amount of unsaturated fat. However, in the process of hydrogenating or adding, making some of the unsaturated fat saturated, in that process, you create what we call trans fatty acids. And so that's why margarine is considered bad, because the trans fats cause problems. But in reality, you will see from the study, they don't cause as much problems as saturated fat. But in any case, this is what they did, these 2 changes. And the soy, of course, is unsaturated, and a fair percentage of the margarine is unsaturated. So at the end of 6 years, These are the results. The left two bars show the cholesterol at the beginning and at the end. And there was a 19% decrease in how much cholesterol was in their bloodstreams as a result of this change. Just two changes, two simple changes. And you know, if you drank that milk that had soy oil in it, I'm not sure you could tell, you couldn't taste the difference. And most people get used to tasting butter or margarine. They're pretty close to each other and so forth. Now, the amazing thing is this. If I had time, I'd tell you why 19% is so remarkable. It is a huge drop. But as a result of that, listen carefully, there was a 56% decrease in the death rate from heart disease because of those two simple changes. Astonishing. Published in 1976. Let's see, it was published in 79. It had run for 6 years. It actually started in 72 or 3. And this is the summary paragraph you can actually read at the end of any scientific paper. Sometimes they call it an abstract, and they put it at the beginning of the paper. And this is not all of it, it's most of it. But, I mean, there's more to come. It is most of what it says, but I'll show you the rest. Dr. Turpinen, who was the leader of the study, said, "We feel the findings of our study justify the conclusion that in men," now this is interesting. I think you could ask 1,000 people on the streets of America. Nobody would know this, that this did not work for women, just men. The conclusion that in men, a cholesterol-lowering diet considerably reduced death, mortality, from coronary heart disease or coronary artery disease. Question, was 56% a considerable reduction in death? Of course it was. And there's a little more here. I haven't even showed you yet all of it. I will in a minute. He goes on to say, that means the data, also indicate that total mortality was favorably affected by this diet, this change. Now, the reason you have to talk about total mortality is this. This isn't everything people die from, but for the sake of illustration, let's say that each of those things listed there, that's what people die from. And if you add them all up, stack them, if you will, on top of each other, I'll just use one color there. That's what we call total mortality. Pretty obvious. And here's the problem. If you have a reduction from something, it might cause a change in some other things, up or down. And if a reduction in one kind of death, or one cause of death, happened for whatever reason to cause an increase in some other kind of death, you got to know about that. So that's why everybody has to speak to total mortality as well as what the diet itself did for the particular thing you're studying, in this case, heart disease. Now notice this. The data also indicate that total mortality was favorably affected by this diet. Here is the rest of the paragraph. One time I went up to a couple and I said to the lady, "If your husband said he loved you, though not conclusively, would he be in trouble?" And she laughed and she said, "He sure would be." You know what this means? This means that the data were not strong enough that you could conclude that total mortality was less. It was less, but the data were not strong enough to show that tiny change was from the study. It could have been up, down, up a little bit, down a little bit. So even though there was this big change in mortality from heart disease, the amount of overall mortality was essentially unchanged. Do American people know that? No, they have no idea. They just think that if you use some olive oil, it'd be good for you. The way Americans use olive oil, it's bad for them because they've heard it's good and they just pour it everywhere. And so your body makes cholesterol. It makes cholesterol for unsaturated fats. It just doesn't make quite as much. Well, you know, what do people want to know? I mean, a whole bunch of people didn't die from heart disease, but they died from something else. You might want to know. You might want to know which, so you could choose, right? So another study was done. This time in the States, instead of in Finland. It was done in Los Angeles at a veterans domicile, a place where vets can live free, live there, eat there, and they did more than just those two things. They did several things. They made hamburger patties out of plants and used unsaturated fat in them. Same amount of fat, but it was unsaturated, as in a regular hamburger patty. They were more careful. If anybody ate at McDonald's or people brought them food, they were taken out of the study. And they ran this for several years and found out that the results were about the same. Heart disease death rate cut in half. Overall death rate essentially unchanged. Well, come on, what's going on? And so what I'm going to put on the screen is a question that was asked from the audience from a panel of the physicians and scientists that did the study. And it's a little clumsy because when people just speak off the cuff, it's not like maybe it would be if you could write it down and edit it. So somebody said, Dr. Laren, he was the study director, how do you explain the relative absence of an effect on the intervention on total mortality? I think you know what that means, but what he's saying is, why do you not have a decrease in total mortality in this trial with all these changes in the food? Now notice his answer. We can't explain it. In other words, we don't understand yet what's going on. But if we remove the main cause of death, which of course is still heart disease, the chance of what is increased? The chance of cancer was increased. And this has been known now for some time. The average American has no clue on this. I remember it was at least 10 to 12 years after this study was completed. I finally saw it reported in a newspaper somewhere. It was actually in Seattle. Some writer had figured this out from the studies and actually put in there, by the way, when people replace animal fat with plant fats, they get more cancer if the fat has been taken out of the plant. And there's reasons for that we'll discuss another time when we look at the cancer question. Pretty serious. In Los Angeles, there's an increased death rate from cancer in the people that got the diet. Enough increase in cancer so that even though there was this big drop in heart disease death, the overall death rate was about the same. Americans have no clue about this. They're killing themselves because they're uninformed. Now let me show this study to you from a little different perspective. This bar, the red plus the yellow, represents the average American. I'm sure you understand the U means unsaturated and the S is saturated fat. That's just what Americans are doing. This is what the study did. Both the one in Finland and the one in Los Angeles replaced some red with some yellow, which means what? They're replacing some saturated fat with unsaturated fat. And notice that the tops are the same level. So when I said replace, that's what that means. Same amount of fat. They just took some saturated out and put unsaturated in. You got these amazing results with heart disease. Not overall death, but with heart disease. Now here's what the Americans thought they were supposed to do. They still think this. They think that olive oil or corn oil or whatever the oil is good for you. So they have their regular meal. And they know that, and so they add olive oil to this, and they add olive oil to that preparation that they're making. And of course, the problem is, it's actually worse for them. Amazing how uninformed Americans are and how it's hurting them so bad. Now, that 40% is a measure of how much of our total calories Americans tend to get as fat. It depends on their socioeconomic status. It's expensive to eat animals in comparison to eating plants. And so that number can vary. But about 40% of the calories in America come from, that's what percentage of their calories comes from fat. They're getting more calories from other things too, of course. And if you go to your cardiologist, he or she finds out that you have some plaque in your heart arteries. They're supposed to put you on the American Heart Association diet, which reduces the percent of your calories that you're getting. Of the total that you're getting, it reduces the amount you're getting from fat down to what? 30% instead of 40. And notice what the red has done. It's very tiny. What does that mean? It means that they're supposed to cut the saturated fat almost completely out. That's the American Heart Association diet. Now, there's actually two phases of it, but this part is the same for both. Now, this word, atherosclerosis, I'm sure you're all familiar with this. It comes from two Greek words, meaning gruel, or mush, if you will, and sclerosis means hard. And here's what's going on. There was a time about, and I'll show you actually a diagram. You can see, this is a drawing, not a picture, but a drawing of an artery. There's 2 layers of muscle. And then you can see this little white layer on the inside of the artery. It's an amazing structure that the Creator has lined our arteries with. We have a name for it, of course. We have a class, it's in a class of tissues, and we have a name for that particular one, not terribly important for our discussion. And what we did not know until about 25 years ago was that the plaque forms under this lining. And we thought for years that plaque would just get bigger and bigger until it filled up the artery and people would have a heart attack. It turns out that about that long ago, physicians and scientists started doing angiograms on people while they were having a heart attack. And it was like they slapped their forehead and said, why didn't we think of that before? Because here's what they saw. 99% of heart attacks do not occur because the plaque filled the artery. What they saw was that this lining, the portion of the lining that was over the plaque, was unhealthy enough so that there was a chance that this mushy stuff would break through and ooze out into the bloodstream. They actually watched this happen. Ooze out into the bloodstream and cause a clot to fill the whole artery in seconds. That's what they slapped their head about. And if you think about it, everybody knows this. People have heart attacks at 32 years, 38, 41, 50, 52, way before you would expect people to have that happen. Why was that happening? Not because their arteries were filling up with plaque. You can call it cholesterol, but it's more complicated than just cholesterol. Not because they were filling up with plaque, but because the lining over the mushy part became unhealthy enough to allow the mushy part to break through, and as soon as a little bit of it gets in the bloodstream, it just tips the scale for clotting, and just in almost like instantaneously, in seconds, a clot forms, and that's the heart attack. Now, I actually have some pictures of this, but before I show them to you, let me just say this. The body seems to understand that the plaque, the soft plaque, and always when plaque is first laid down, it's soft. The body seems to understand that that's bad, and it strives to make that plaque stable by putting calcium in there and building some fibrous cells and structure in there so that the soft stuff won't ooze out, because now it's hard. That's where this term came from. Before we knew that the way that worked, we realized that sometimes it's soft and later on it's hard. So the body is desperately trying to stabilize that stuff. But if I keep living like what made that plaque, that soft plaque form, I still have the problem. The body can't keep up with it. So the hard part of atherosclerosis is not dangerous. Only 1 out of 100 heart attacks occurred because that plaque filled the whole artery. What's dangerous is the soft plaque. And the amazing thing is, we now know, this is a long story that I can't take time to tell. We now know that if people will change their lifestyle, if they'll start using only plants unrefined for their food, that the lining becomes healthy. And even if there was some soft plaque, it's no longer dangerous. It's the most remarkable thing. When we first learned that, it seemed like it might take a couple of months for it to become safe. And as the studies went on, pretty soon it was 1 month, and pretty soon it was 2 weeks, and pretty soon it was 1 week. And what is in the literature today is that the lining is, the condition of the lining is dynamic, which means it's always changing. One lousy meal, and lining can shift from being safe to being dangerous. I have several friends who are ER docs. At least I can name 6 personal friends who have been ER docs. I can think of a couple of more suddenly too. And they will tell you that around 2 o'clock in the morning, the ER department gets busy with heart attacks because of the terrible meal that somebody had late that evening before they went to bed. An amazing story. Now, 25 years ago, this year, Dr. Dean Ornish, and actually some associates, wanted to study to see if lifestyle would make this difference. Not only make a difference in terms of how many people died, but to see if you could reverse the plaque. Now, everybody knew, I'm talking about the scientists and the physicians, that you could not reverse the disease. So Ornish couldn't get any money from the National Institutes of Health. He had to raise the money privately. He got 24 men with angiographic data on their arteries in their heart. And he, at random, put 12 in the experimental group and 12 in a control group. He measured from the angiographs every little piece, about a half a centimeter of the artery, and he would write down how much blockage there was, the 3 main arteries, each man, and then he would average that, what was the average blockage, and he did it for all 12, and all 12. And the experimental group had an average of 40% blockage. Some places no blockage, some places almost blocked off completely, but an average. And he put them on he actually did 5 things. It wasn't the best science. He put them on a plant-based regimen. He took away the plants that are high in fat, olives, avocados, nuts, and seeds. He took those out because he wanted to get the fat intake low. He had them be active. Exercise is the word people mostly use. And he taught them stress control, and he had meditation. Now, the reason it's poor science, whatever the outcome is, you don't know which of those things made it happen. But that's what he did. And after 12 months, and most of the money went into this as well, got the angiographs of their hearts. And the guys that were on the plant-based regimen and did all these other things had a decrease of almost 6% in their plaque. And I wish you all would have said, amazing. It is amazing. Everybody knew you could not do this. I say everybody, the scientific community, just blown away, if you will, to use a term that we're familiar with, that this could be done. Now, the control group, he told them, he actually put them on the American Heart Association diet. Mind you, the diet that cardiologists are supposed to put you on when you have heart disease. He told them to exercise. He didn't measure it. He didn't control it. He told them to control their stress, but he wasn't working with them like he did with the experimental people. And their blockage on average for the 12 men was just a little higher than the other. It's just a statistical difference. It's not significant that it was a little more or less. The amazing thing is, at the end of the same 12 months, even though they were on the American Heart Association diet, he provided all the food for them. Their plaque increased by almost 9%. Astonishing. This is what's happening to Americans. And in fact, Americans aren't even following the American Heart Association diet. So they're even worse off with their plaque increase each year. Astonishing. Astonishing what it could be. It's sad for what it is. Well, there's the American Heart Association diet. Here's some actual pictures I got from Dr. Castelli, the director of the Framingham Heart Study. And this is an artery. We call it a cross-section. I think you know what that means. It's like it's coming out of the picture or out of the board, and you chop it off. And all of the dark area, first of all, the artery is that kind of that circle there. And all of the dark area is plaque. There's right in the middle is the soft part. That's we actually call it the atheromatous core. Remember, athero means mush. That part is mush. The rest of that was once mush, but the body has managed to make it all hard to try to keep a heart attack from happening. And then on the right hand side there's that space that looks like a little bit of a backward L. That's where the blood is flowing. Maybe about... I don't think it's even 15%. So this is like an 85% blockage. And this is actually not probably a dangerous one because the body has managed to get so much of it hard. Here's another example. The atheromatous core is that reddish thing, kind of right of center there. The white part above it is where the artery is still open. These, of course, were post-mortems. These people died, and then their arteries were examined. Now that soft stuff, in fact, can you see the lining? You can see the lining of the artery there. You see that kind of light-colored lining inside that white area? And you can see how close the soft stuff is to that lining. So this is probably a pretty dangerous plaque because if the lining is unhealthy, which the way Americans live, the linings are unhealthy, and that soft plaque could easily break through there and cause a heart attack. Now here's another one. This man died of this clot. The interesting thing about this one, the red places where the clot formed, that's where the artery was open. The rest of that whole circle is all plaque. And the interesting thing, if you'll notice there in the bottom left corner of that blood clot, there is the ooze of the soft plaque that actually got caught in the clot. The clot actually caught the oozing, or the oozing caused the plaque to form, the clot to form so quickly that it actually caught that ooze. This is what's killing Americans. Almost 700,000 men and women die in this country every year from the event you're looking at right there. Astonishing. Now, there's the same picture. Americans are getting 40% of their fat from their calories from fat. The American Heart Association cuts it to 30. This is what Ornish did. He cut the number of calories they were getting from fat to just 10%. And look at the red, almost non-existent. This is the whole deal with saturated fat. It's bad for the heart. So they take it out, and they try to get them food that has very little saturated fat. It comes from plants. That's the only way you can get it. Unrefined plants. So 10% makes you better. 30% makes you worse. Somewhere in between, you don't get better or worse. And that's probably, that's been actually fairly well demonstrated now. If you eat unrefined plants, you're not using any free fats like margarine or butter or oils or Crisco, and you're just using plants. You get your fat intake. And by the way, this is including the 4 categories of plants that are high in fat, the olives, avocados, nuts, and seeds, which in order to reverse the plaque, you have to leave those out. And that's what Ornish did. That's what Esselstyn did in that study that I showed you at the beginning. So if somebody's not sick, if they don't have plaque and it's not dangerous, they can eat all the plants, even the nuts, olives, and avocados and seeds, and we find that they do not get an increase in heart disease. So that's the place to try to land. And here is how it happens. This is a drawing now, not a picture. I showed you 3 pictures of actual arteries. You can see the lining, you can see the white. It's not necessarily white. The artist just paints it like that. Although, in that picture you saw where I said, see the lining? It is lightly colored in comparison to the muscle. And behind that white lining is two layers of muscle. I won't get into the details there. What I want to do now is take a little portion of that picture and make it fill the screen. So in a moment, the left half of the screen will be inside the artery and the right half will be lining and muscle, and it's magnified enough that we'll actually draw cells. So here it is, if I can make it come there. There is the lining. It's a different kind of cell than all of those underneath it. That lining is almost like tongue and groove. It's very tight. It's designed to be that way to keep things that shouldn't get in or out. And then the muscle cells behind them. And here's what happens. This is a simplified version, but it is correct. The lining gets unhealthy, and cells will even die. And I'm going to show a dent. See the dent? Now, this is a metaphor. It's not a dent. It's a chemical assault on the cell. Because of the way we live, the cell gets sick, and so the lining is now weakened. And that cell may even die. It certainly is going to get full of fatty particles. And when that happens, here comes the macrophage. You can say macrophage, macrophage. It's actually 2 Greek words that mean big eater. And this guy travels around the body, everywhere in your body. It's an amazing, living, traveling cell. It can travel through the wall of a blood vessel. It can travel through bone. Anyway, it can just go anywhere, and they do. They're in the bloodstream. They're traveling everywhere looking for stuff to clean up. They're kind of like a garbage truck in a way. And so here he comes in the picture now. That's the extra thing I've drawn. Right there in the middle, sitting right near the sick lining cell. And because that lining cell is full of fat, and it's dying, he actually eats it up. Then the 2 cells on either side chemically talk to each other, and they make a new lining. But of course, the way people are living, the lining gets rather poor in health in many places all through the arteries. It doesn't just happen in the coronary artery. It happens in all of our arteries. It's just that it kills us here. It can also kill us, not as much, not as many people die from atherosclerosis in the brain, but certainly many do. So that's why we call it, by the way, cardiovascular disease. It doesn't just happen in the heart, cardio. It happens all over the body, in the arteries, not in the veins. And I don't have time to explain why that's the case, but it's interesting. So, here's what happens if there's too much fat in your blood, which is the case for almost all Americans. The little yellow balls I've drawn there represent the lipids, would be a better term. And the lipids don't travel by themselves because they're not water soluble. They travel in little trucks. And you may not know this, but everybody in this country today knows about the bad and the good cholesterol, which is crazy because the cholesterols are the same. But one of the trucks is called an LDL. I say truck, that's a metaphor. This thing carries fat in your blood. LDL, everybody knows about that. HDL, everybody knows about that. Those are actually trucks that carry lipid around your body because the lipids can't be in the blood by themselves because they're not water soluble. So that's what you see there. Too much in the way of lipids in the bloodstream, and the macrophage, when it's there cleaning up, trying to repair the lining, it also has receptors that gobble up the fatty particles to try to protect the body. So while it's there, it gobbles up while it's exposed either to the blood or even if it comes up from underneath, because these particles from the blood the fatty particles, these trucks, they meander down into the muscle. And so while he's there fixing something, cleaning something up, he eats a bunch of those things, and because there's so much of it in Americans' blood, he fills up with it and he can no longer ooze around. He's stuck there. And actually he dies. And guess what happens when he dies? Another garbage truck comes along to clean him up. And when that one dies, another one comes, and it's actually, watch this carefully, it's the accumulation of these macrophages that is the plaque. And that's why when the plaque first forms, it's soft. It's gooey fat, gooey lipids, LDL particles, HDL particles. There's 18 of them. Americans know about 2. There's 16 more. And some of them are more dangerous than others. It's a very interesting story that we do talk about in other programs. Well, the interesting thing is, the amazing thing is, your body, would it make sense to you that if I would live my life, if I, especially what I would eat, could lower the amount of those of the lipid particles in my blood, that the body could clean up all this soft plaque? And we have studies that show in 12 months, all the soft plaque was gone. So it's an amazing thing. And obviously, the appeal here is, you can get well. You can be well if you would change the way you live and eat. God bless you all.